We just moved in. The HOA president smiled at us. That smile was a lie. The fines started. Within a month, her son picked a target. She thought we'd fold quietly. She had no idea who my son really was. My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm 42, a structural engineer, and a single father to Elijah, 15, quiet, disciplined, and carrying more weight than any kid should. We moved to Ridgemont Oaks that August, chasing better schools and a clean slate after his mother passed. I told him it would be different here. I believed it too. Elijah wasn't the loud type. He woke at 5 every morning, laced up his shoes, and ran the perimeter of whatever neighborhood we lived in before most people poured their first coffee. Back home, coaches called him a phenomenon. Here, he just wanted to be a normal kid with a normal house and no whispers following him down the hallway. Ridgemont Oaks looked like a postcard, manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, a welcome committee that showed up with a fruit basket and a thick binder of rules. At the center of it stood Deborah Whitfield, HOA president for 6 consecutive years, a woman who introduced herself by title before she gave her name. Deborah's handshake was firm and her eyes were already cataloging us. The moving truck, the basketball hoop still wrapped in plastic, the color of our front door. "We like to keep things cohesive here," she said, tapping the binder. I nodded politely. Cohesive was her word for controlled. Her son Tyler leaned against their driveway, arms crossed, watching us unload boxes like we were trespassing on land he personally owned. He was 16, built like a linebacker who skipped leg day, and wore his father's old varsity jacket like armor. He didn't wave a beat too long. The first week was fine, almost suspiciously fine. Neighbors brought over banana bread. A retired teacher named Mrs. Alvarez offered to walk with Elijah to the bus stop so he'd know the route. Deborah, though, drove by our house twice that week. Slow, deliberate, like she was measuring something only she could see. Then the first notice appeared, taped neatly to our door. A citation for unauthorized recreational equipment. Our basketball hoop, still in its box in the garage, not even assembled. I laughed at first, thinking it was a mistake. Deborah's signature at the bottom told me it wasn't. This was a warning shot, dressed up as paperwork. I called the HOA office to clarify. The woman on the phone sighed like she'd fielded this call before. Mrs. knew resident properties personally, she said. She likes to set the tone early. I asked what tone that was. She didn't answer, but her hesitation told me everything. Elijah started school that Monday, and I watched him walk to the bus stop with his shoulders squared, the way he always did before something hard. He'd learned that posture the year kids at his old school decided his quietness meant he was an easy target. He was wrong about that once. He wouldn't be twice. Tyler was in Elijah's grade. Same lunch period. Same gym class. Elijah didn't mention him that first day, which told me something had already happened. When I asked how school was, he just said, "Fine," and disappeared into his room. The universal teenage code for something is very much not fine. Deborah, meanwhile, had appointed herself our unofficial tour guide, showing up unannounced with more rules than welcome. "We don't do window units," she said. eyeing our air conditioner. We don't do clotheslines. We don't do loud music after 8. Every sentence started with we, as if the neighborhood spoke through her alone. I noticed the Coopers 3 houses down had a trampoline. Unsighted. The Bakers had wind chimes that rang past 9 most nights. Unsighted. I started keeping a mental list, then a written one, because something in my gut told me the rules weren't rules at all. They were a leash, and it was only meant for us. At the mailbox one afternoon, an older neighbor named Frank pulled me aside, voice low. "Deborah ran the last black family out of here in 8 months," he said. "Nice as pie to your face. Ruthless behind your back. Watch your paperwork. Watch your kid." Unsure yet how seriously to take it. That night I told Elijah what Frank said. He didn't look surprised. Said finally, "Tyler, twice today. Called it an accident both times." I asked if he wanted me to say something. He shook his head. "Dad, I always can." I believed him, mostly because I'd seen what he could handle before: grief, relocation, the quiet erasure of the life we used to have. But handling bullies wasn't the same as handling grief. And I didn't yet know how far Tyler, backed by his mother's quiet permission, was willing to go. The second HOA notice arrived within the week, a fine for our trash cans being visible outside designated hours, despite them sitting exactly where the Bakers had sat all summer. I photographed everything now, timestamps, angles, our cans beside theirs. I didn't know yet that I was building a file. I just knew I needed proof. Deborah began attending Elijah's bus stop pickups under the guise of community safety, clipboard in hand, watching him with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd rehearsed her disapproval into something that looked like concern. Mrs. that Deborah had never once shown up before we moved in. It happened on a Thursday. Tyler and 2 friends cornered Elijah near the community mailboxes, close enough that Mrs. Alvarez saw it from her porch. They knocked his backpack into the mud, laughed, called him something Mrs. Alvarez wouldn't repeat to me directly but said made her blood run cold. Elijah didn't fight back. He picked up his bag, wiped it down, and walked home like nothing happened, jaw tight, eyes forward. When I asked about the mud on his sleeve, he lied and said he tripped. I let the lie stand that day, but I filed it away with everything else I was collecting. Mrs. willing to let it go, though. She called Deborah directly to report what she'd witnessed. Deborah's response, relayed to me later word for word, was chilling in its calm. Boys will be boys. I'm sure Elijah can hold his own. He seems like the athletic type. That phrase, the athletic type, sat wrong with me for days before I understood why. It wasn't a compliment. It was a box. Drawn quickly and without asking. The same box that had followed my son through every school hallway since he was old enough to be seen as anything other than a child. I requested a meeting with the HOA board about the fines. Deborah rescheduled it twice, then finally sat across from me at a folding table with 2 other board members who said almost nothing the entire time. She smiled through every question, agreed to review the citations, and changed absolutely nothing. That same week, someone spray-painted a slur on the side of our shed. Deborah's response wasn't outrage. It was a citation for unremoved vandalism, dated 2 days after the incident. as if the crime were the paint still being there rather than the hate that put it there in the first place. I filed a police report. The responding officer was polite but unhurried, told me these things were hard to trace, and left without dusting for anything. Deborah, notified as HOA president, sent a community-wide email reminding everyone to maintain property standards, never once mentioning what had actually happened to our shed. Elijah found the email before I could shield him from it. He read it twice, silent, then went out back and scrubbed the paint off himself before I even got home from work, like erasing the evidence would erase what it meant. I found him still scrubbing, knuckles raw, and pulled him inside. That night, for the first time since we'd moved, he told me the truth about Tyler, not just the mailbox incident, but weeks of small cruelties, tripped feet, spilled lunch trays, a locker jammed shut with gum. He'd been protecting me from it, the same way I'd been trying to protect him from grief. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked. He looked at me with an exhaustion no 15-year-old should carry. "Because you already have enough to fight, Dad." I didn't want to be one more thing. I held him then, and I made a promise to myself that he wouldn't fight this alone anymore. I started documenting everything with the seriousness of a man building a case, because that's exactly what I was doing. Photos of citations, screenshots of the community email, a written timeline, Mrs. account. I didn't know yet where it would lead, only that Deborah Whitfield underestimated how thorough I could be. Deborah, for her part, seemed to sense the shift in me and didn't like it. She started smiling less when we crossed paths, replaced by a tight, praising look, the kind people give an opponent they're recalculating. Tyler's bullying, meanwhile, escalated in small, deniable ways, the kind adults dismiss as boys being boys. At the next HOA meeting, held in the clubhouse under fluorescent lights, I raised the fines publicly. Deborah handled it beautifully, pivoting the conversation toward community harmony and thanking me for my passion, a word she used like a leash to make my concerns sound like overreaction. The room nodded along with her. Only one board member, a quiet man named Gary who handled the HOA's finances, caught my eye afterward and didn't nod along. He said nothing that night, but the way he lingered told me he'd seen something too, something he wasn't ready to say out loud yet in that room full of Deborah's loyalists. Elijah asked to try out for the school's track team that week, cautious hope in his voice, like he was testing whether this new life would let him have that part of himself back. I told him yes immediately. What I didn't yet know was that Deborah's reach extended even into the school's parent boosters. Tryouts went the way they always did. Elijah left the coaching staff speechless, times that made assistant coaches recheck their stopwatches twice. He came home lighter than I'd seen him in months. And for one evening, Ridgemont Oaks felt like it might actually become the fresh start we'd promised each other. That lightness didn't last. Tyler, who'd also tried out and finished mid-pack, watched Elijah's numbers get posted on the locker room board with an expression that Elijah described to me later as pure venom. Something in Tyler's pride had cracked, and cracked pride, I would soon learn, made Deborah dangerous in an entirely new way. The next morning, a new HOA notice waited on our door, this one alleging unauthorized commercial activity, because Elijah had been photographed jogging past a neighbor's yard sale wearing a shirt from his old running club. Deborah's interpretation stretched the rulebook into something almost comedic. if it hadn't been so clearly personal. I stopped responding to the notices individually and instead requested every citation issued to every household that year, citing my rights as a dues-paying resident. The HOA office stalled for 11 days before finally sending a partial, redacted list. Even redacted, the pattern was impossible to miss. Our house appeared more than any other combined. Gary, the quiet treasurer, found a reason to walk past our house on a Saturday, ostensibly checking sprinkler compliance. He lingered at the end of our driveway and said quietly, "You're not the only one she's done this to. Just the only one still fighting." Then he left before I could ask him more. Tyler's bullying grew bolder at school, emboldened by his mother's example of consequence-free cruelty. He started a rumor that Elijah had been kicked out of his last school for fighting, a lie built from nothing but Tyler's own resentment. Kids who didn't know Elijah yet started keeping a wary, unearned distance from him. Elijah handled it with a discipline that both amazed and worried me. Never raising his voice, never taking the bait, running his laps every morning like the ground itself owed him nothing but honesty. But I could see the toll in the way he stopped smiling at breakfast, stopped talking about his day unprompted. Deborah escalated her campaign against our house specifically, now claiming our porch light was non-compliant wattage, and citing us for a garden gnome that had, in fact, belonged to the previous owners and sat exactly where it always had. Each citation carried a fine, and the fines were beginning to add up meaningfully. I began attending every HOA meeting, notebook in hand, asking pointed questions about citation consistency across the neighborhood. Deborah answered each one with practiced grace, but her jaw tightened a fraction more every time, until I was learning to read like a second language born purely out of necessity. One evening, walking Elijah's usual running route to check on him, I found Tyler and two friends had scattered broken glass along the sidewalk where Elijah ran each morning. I photographed it, called the police, and this time insisted on a case number, refusing to leave until an officer actually walked the scene. Deborah arrived at the scene within 20 minutes, suspiciously fast for someone who claimed to have just been driving by. She immediately suggested to the officer that neighborhood kids often left debris, and that it was probably unrelated to anyone specific, steering the conversation away from her son with practiced, maternal ease. The officer, unmoved by her performance, noted the glass pattern was deliberately scattered, not accidental debris, and logged it as a possible act of vandalism targeting a specific resident. It was the first time an authority figure hadn't simply taken Deborah's word as gospel, and I watched her recalibrate in real time. That recalibration turned into something colder. Within days, Deborah proposed a new HOA rule at the next meeting. Mandatory curfew compliance for residents under 18, framed as a community safety measure but timed, suspiciously, right after Elijah's 5 a.m. runs had become neighborhood knowledge through Deborah's own gossip network. I spoke against the proposal directly, pointing out it would criminalize a teenager's morning exercise while ignoring actual vandalism happening in broad daylight. Several neighbors murmured agreement, emboldened, I think, by finally seeing someone push back on Deborah in a room where pushing back had apparently never happened before. The curfew proposal failed by a narrow vote, Deborah's first public loss in years, and she did not take it well. She thanked the board for their input, through a smile so tight it looked painful, then caught my eye across the room with a look that promised this wasn't over. Elijah's track coach, a sharp woman named Coach Duval, called me that week to say she'd heard concerning noise from a few Ridgemont Oaks parents suggesting Elijah's eligibility should be reviewed due to recent behavioral reports. No such reports existed. I recognized Deborah's fingerprints on the accusation immediately, even without proof yet. I requested the source of these behavioral reports in writing. The school administration, to their credit, couldn't produce any, and Coach Duval quietly closed the matter. But not before telling me she'd keep a closer eye on who exactly kept calling her office asking pointed questions about the new kid. Frank, our early warning neighbor, invited me over for coffee and finally told me the fuller story of the family before us. The HOA family, run out after 8 months of manufactured citations, a false theft accusation, and finally a restraining order Deborah filed after staging a confrontation no one else witnessed. She's done this before, Frank said, stirring his coffee slowly. She finds a reason to make people feel unwelcome. Then when they push back, she finds a reason to make them feel unsafe. By the time anyone believes them, they're already gone. I asked him why no one had stopped her. He had no answer. Armed with Frank's account, I reached out to the HOA family through a mutual contact Frank provided. Mrs. At first, understandably guarded, but eventually shared documentation of her own, citations nearly identical in language and timing to ours, right down to the suspiciously specific wattage complaints. The pattern was no longer circumstantial. Deborah had a documented history, a playbook she reused on families she decided didn't belong, and I now had 2 case files instead of 1. I began to understand this wasn't just a bad neighbor situation. It was something closer to a system, quietly running for years unchecked. Meanwhile, Tyler's bullying took a sharper turn. He began following Elijah's social media, screenshotting old posts from his previous track meets and posting them with mocking captions to a private group chat that eventually leaked to Elijah through a sympathetic classmate. The captions weren't just cruel. They were racially loaded, unmistakably so. Elijah showed me the screenshots without a word, just handed me his phone and sat on the edge of his bed, waiting for my reaction. I felt something cold and clarifying settle over me, the kind of anger that doesn't shout but plans. I told him we were taking this to the school immediately. The school's response was slower than I wanted, but not nothing. Tyler received a formal warning and a mandatory conversation with the counselor, though no suspension, a decision I suspected owed something to his father's seat on the school's booster club, another quiet thread connecting the Whitfield family's influence. Deborah, informed of the school meeting through channels I never fully traced, showed up at our door that evening uninvited, voice syrupy with concern. "I heard there was some misunderstanding at school," she said. "Boys can be cruel to each other sometimes. I hope Elijah isn't too sensitive about typical teenage teasing." I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that racially targeted harassment wasn't typical teenage teasing, and that I expected her, as HOA president and Tyler's mother, to take it seriously rather than minimize it on our porch. Her smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes went very still and calculating. "I'll speak with Tyler," she said finally, in a tone that made clear she had no intention of doing so meaningfully. She left with a parting comment about hoping things could stay peaceful in the neighborhood, a phrase that felt less like hope and more like a warning wrapped in politeness. Things did not stay peaceful. 2 days later, our car's tires were slashed overnight. All four. In a driveway with a working motion light that had somehow malfunctioned that exact evening according to the HOA's own maintenance log. A log Gary quietly forwarded to me without comment attached. The police investigated again. This time with more skepticism toward the coincidence. But without direct video evidence. They couldn't charge anyone. Deborah, when questioned as HOA president about the malfunctioning light, expressed shock and promised a full review of the security system. A review that, predictably, went nowhere. I installed my own cameras that week. Discreet ones aimed at our driveway and the shed. Paid for out of pocket because I no longer trusted the HOA's community security to do anything but protect the Whitfields. It was a small, quiet declaration that I was done waiting for someone else to protect us. Elijah, meanwhile, kept running every morning, refusing to let the tire slashing or the group chat or any of it take his one steady ritual away from him. I watched him leave at 5 a.m. With a mixture of pride and fear I couldn't fully separate, wondering what waited for him at the end of each mile. Coach Duval called again. This time with better news. Elijah's Times had qualified him for the regional invitational, an event scouts sometimes attended. She asked if I'd mind her reaching out to a contact at a state athletic association. Mentioning Elijah's name had already started drawing quiet, admiring attention. I said yes without hesitation, grateful for a piece of good news amid everything else. Elijah's reaction, when I told him, was the first real smile I'd seen from him in weeks, small, cautious, but real. For one evening, Ridgemont Oaks and the Whitfields felt very far away from what actually mattered. That good news reached Deborah too. Somehow, likely through the same gossip network that had informed on Elijah's running schedule. Her response wasn't celebration. It was a new line of questioning at the next HOA meeting about whether outside recruiters should be allowed to solicit minors within the community without board approval. The room looked at her with open confusion this time. Several neighbors visibly uncomfortable with how far she was reaching to manufacture a problem out of a teenager's track invitation. Gary finally spoke up publicly for the first time, asking dryly whether the HOA bylaws actually addressed youth athletics at all. They did not. Deborah's proposal died in the room. But the attempt itself told me everything about how far she was willing to stretch her authority to diminish my son. It wasn't really about rules anymore, if it ever had been. It was about control. And Elijah's quiet excellence had become something she couldn't stand to witness unchallenged. I began quietly reaching out to other residents Frank mentioned might have their own stories. And slowly, carefully, a small pattern of trust started forming. People willing to share screenshots, timestamps, old citations, all pieces of a puzzle I hadn't set out to build but now felt responsible for finishing. One resident, a retired accountant named Mr. Okafor, mentioned almost in passing that he'd once noticed inconsistencies in the HOA's annual financial disclosure. Numbers that didn't quite reconcile with the reported landscaping and maintenance costs. He'd let it go at the time. He wasn't sure he wanted to let it go anymore. I asked Gary, carefully, without accusation, whether he'd noticed anything unusual in the books during his time as treasurer. He went quiet for a long moment, then said only, "I've noticed things I can't explain yet. I need more time before I say anything I can't take back." I didn't push further that night. Tyler's harassment, meanwhile, took a new shape at school. He started a betting pool among a small circle of friends over whether Elijah would snap and get himself expelled, treating my son's restraint as a countdown clock rather than the discipline it actually was. A classmate quietly told Elijah about it. Disgusted, Elijah told me about the betting pool with a bitter, exhausted laugh. The kind that isn't really funny at all. They think I'm a bomb waiting to go off, he said. They don't get that I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to be anyone's excuse to prove a point about people like me. I told him I was proud of that discipline. And I meant it completely. But privately I worried about the cost of it. What it takes from a 15-year-old to carry that much restraint every single day while the people around him faced no consequences at all for testing it relentlessly. For a stretch of nearly 2 weeks, things went quiet. No new citations. No new incidents. Polite but cool at community events. And Tyler's group chat, according to Elijah, had gone dormant, perhaps chastened slightly by the school's involvement. Felt less like peace than a held breath. I used the lull to organize everything I'd gathered: citations, timelines, witness accounts from Frank and Mrs. Say, the tire slashing report, the group chat screenshots. I built a folder, physical and digital, that I hoped I'd never need to use but suspected, with growing certainty, that I eventually would. Elijah's regional invitational approached, and Coach Duval confirmed a scout from a respected track program would be attending specifically to watch him run. Felt, for the first time since we'd arrived, like something good was building faster than something bad. And I let myself believe that maybe the worst had passed. I invited Frank and Mrs. Alvarez to the invitational. Small gestures of gratitude for people who'd shown my son and me kindness when the neighborhood's official welcome had turned out to be conditional. Frank accepted immediately. Mrs. wouldn't miss it, already bragging to her book club about our runner. Gary, unexpectedly, asked if he could come too. When I raised an eyebrow, he admitted quietly that he wanted to see, with his own eyes, what all the fuss over this kid was about, separate from Deborah's version of events. I told him he was welcome, and something in his posture eased. The night before the invitational, Elijah couldn't sleep, and I found him in the kitchen at midnight, staring at his old medals from his previous school, the ones he'd packed away when we moved because looking at them had hurt too much. I want to run for me again, he said.
Not to prove.
I told him that sounded exactly right. That the moment running became about Deborah or Tyler or proving anything to anyone was the moment they'd already won something they didn't deserve. He nodded slowly, put the medals back in the box, but this time set the box on his shelf instead of in the closet. The quiet stretched one more day, long enough that I let myself hope it might actually hold. That maybe the school meeting and the failed curfew proposal and the community's growing discomfort had finally taught Deborah there were limits. I should have known better. Recognized limits. She recognized opportunities. Mrs. That week, with a piece of information she'd been sitting on, hesitant to share until she trusted I'd use it carefully. A name of a former HOA board member, forced out years earlier, who'd apparently discovered something about Deborah's handling of community funds before being pressured to resign quietly. I found the former board member, a woman named Patricia Nguyen, now living 2 towns over. She agreed to meet, cautious and clearly still uneasy discussing Deborah even years later. She has a way of making you feel like you're the problem, Patricia said. Even when you're the one who caught her. Patricia described discrepancies in landscaping invoices years earlier. Work billed but never fully completed. Funds that seemed to route through a company with ties to Deborah's husband. She'd raised it once at a board meeting and was quietly ousted within 2 months on unrelated, manufactured grounds. She'd been too afraid to fight it. I asked if she'd be willing to share anything in writing, understanding fully if she said no. She hesitated a long moment, then said she'd think about it, that Deborah's reach into the community still felt long even from a distance. I thanked her and left my number, hoping patience would earn trust. Elijah's invitational finally arrived. Sunny and sharp-aired, the kind of morning that felt like it belonged to him specifically. He warmed up quietly at the edge of the track, earbuds in. The world narrowed down to lane markers and breath. None of Ridgemont Oaks or Deborah Whitfield anywhere in his focus. I watched him line up for his heat with Frank on one side of me and Gary, quietly attentive, on the other, and for one suspended moment before the starting gun. None of the fines or the slashed tires or the group chats mattered at all. There was just my son, and the track, and the gun. He ran the race of his life, shattering the invitational record by a margin that made the scout's clipboard nearly slip from her hands. The crowd, mostly strangers, rose to their feet. Frank hooped loud enough to embarrass himself. Gary just stood there, quiet, recalculating something behind his eyes I couldn't quite read yet. The scout approached us afterward, introducing herself as representing a well-regarded university program, and spoke to Elijah directly, treating him like the serious athlete he actually was rather than a curiosity. Elijah, still catching his breath, answered her questions with a composure that made my chest ache with pride. Word of the record spread through the school and, inevitably, through the neighborhood grapevine within days. Where I'd hoped it might soften Deborah's hostility, replacing suspicion with something like grudging respect, it instead seemed to sharpen something in her, a competitive resentment she wore poorly beneath her practiced community president's smile. At the next community event, a neighborhood barbecue Deborah organized with typical fanfare, she made a point of congratulating Elijah loudly in front of several neighbors, then added, just quiet enough to seem private but clearly meant to be overheard. Must be nice having something you're naturally gifted at without trying too hard. The implication landed exactly as intended, stripping months of 5 a.m. runs and discipline training down to some kind of unearned, almost animal advantage. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, walking away with a politeness Deborah clearly hadn't expected and visibly didn't appreciate receiving in return. Tyler, standing nearby, laughed at his mother's comment loud enough for others to hear, adding his own remark about some people having natural advantages that had nothing to do with practice. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Mrs., to her credit, told him flatly to knock it off, right there in front of everyone. Deborah's smile faltered for just a second at being publicly corrected by Mrs. Alvarez, quickly recovering into a laugh about kids being kids, but the moment had cracked something open in the neighborhood's collective silence. A few more people started meeting my eyes with something like solidarity rather than polite distance. That night, Gary called me, voice lower and more urgent than I'd heard from him before. "I found something," he said. "In the old invoices. I need you to see it before I decide what to do with it." We agreed to meet the next evening, away from the neighborhood, somewhere neither of us would be seen together. We met at a diner 2 towns over, the same one Patricia had chosen, and Gary spread printed invoices across the table, landscaping charges for work on common areas that, according to dated photographs he'd also brought, had never actually been completed, totaling nearly $40,000 over 3 years. The invoices traced back to a company called Whitfield Ground Solutions, technically independent on paper but registered to an address Gary recognized immediately as Deborah's husband's old business office. It wasn't proof of anything criminal on its own, Gary cautioned, but it was a thread, and threads, pulled carefully, tended to unravel. I asked Gary why he was choosing to come forward now, after apparently sitting on suspicions for a while. He was quiet for a moment before answering. "I watched her go after a 15-year-old kid for jogging past a yard sale," he said.
"I decided I didn't want to be complete."
We agreed to keep gathering quietly rather than confronting Deborah prematurely, since a woman who could manufacture citations out of nothing would almost certainly manufacture a defense out of nothing too, if given warning. Patience, we both understood now, was our only real advantage against someone who controlled the paperwork. Meanwhile, Tyler's resentment over the invitational record festered into something uglier. He began a new tactic at school, spreading a rumor that Elijah's record had been unofficial or somehow fraudulent, a claim so easily disproven by the meet officials that it mostly just made Tyler look increasingly unstable to his own friends. Coach Duvall pulled Tyler aside after hearing the rumor, warning him formally that further harassment of a teammate, even one on a different team, would result in disciplinary action affecting his own eligibility for the football season. Tyler backed off publicly, but Elijah told me the group chat had simply gone private again. Deborah, perhaps sensing her son's frustration mirrored her own, escalated her approach at the HOA level, quietly proposing a change to the community bylaws requiring all youth extracurricular achievements featured in the community newsletter to be independently verified before publication. A rule so transparently aimed at Elijah that even her allies hesitated. The proposal failed again, this time by a wider margin, and I noticed something shifting in the room during that meeting. Fewer nodding heads when Deborah spoke. More glances exchanged between neighbors who were beginning, slowly, to see the pattern I'd been documenting for months without their knowledge. Patricia and Gwyn finally called, having decided to provide a written account of what she'd witnessed on the board years earlier, citing the growing unease she felt watching history repeat itself with our family. Her statement, combined with Gary's invoices and Mrs. Osei's citation records, was becoming something I could no longer call circumstantial. I reached out cautiously to a local journalist who covered community and municipal issues, not yet with the intent to publish anything, but simply to ask what kind of documentation would be needed to substantiate a pattern of HOA misconduct if it ever came to that. She was interested immediately, which unsettled me slightly. Elijah, unaware of the deeper investigation building around him, focused on his training, his times improving week over week under Coach Duvall's careful guidance. He'd started smiling more at dinner again, telling me small, ordinary stories about school that had nothing to do with Tyler or Deborah, and I savored every one of them. That ordinary calm broke on a Tuesday evening when I received a call from the school informing me Elijah had been sent to the principal's office following an altercation during gym class. My stomach dropped as I drove there, replaying every worst-case scenario, wondering if his restraint had finally, understandably, reached its limit. When I arrived, I found Elijah sitting calmly outside the office, uninjured, arms crossed, jaw set in that same disciplined line I recognized from months of him absorbing far worse without complaint. He looked at me and said only, "I didn't touch him, Dad. I promise you." The principal explained that Tyler had reported Elijah threatening him during a basketball drill, though 2 other students in the class had already independently told a teacher a very different version, that Tyler had thrown an elbow into Elijah's ribs deliberately, and Elijah had simply stepped back and said nothing at all. The gym teacher's own account, once finally solicited, matched the student's version exactly, and the altercation evaporated into what it actually was. Another manufactured accusation, this time escalated to the level of school administration, presumably in the hope that it would finally stick where the earlier rumors hadn't. I asked the principal directly whether Tyler had a pattern of reporting incidents involving Elijah specifically. The uncomfortable pause that followed told me the administration was aware of exactly that pattern, even if no one there had yet been willing to name it plainly in front of a parent. Driving home, Elijah was quiet for a long stretch before finally saying, "I keep waiting for it to be enough. Enough restraint. Enough good grades. Enough winning races the right way. But it's never enough for them, is it?" I didn't have a comforting lie ready, so I told him the truth instead. "It was never about whether it's enough," I said. "It's about what they've decided about us before we ever said a word. That's not something you can outperform your way out of. But it is something we can expose. Together. And I need you to trust me that we're close to doing exactly that." He looked at me for a long moment, something settling behind his eyes. Not quite relief, but recognition that he wasn't carrying this alone anymore. That the folder of documentation I'd mentioned only vaguely before was becoming something real, something with weight, something that might finally hold Deborah accountable for all of it. Deborah, informed of the gym class incident's dismissal, did not let the matter rest quietly.
She sent a scathing email to the HOA distribution list, technically about community youth conflict resolution.
The email backfired more spectacularly than she likely anticipated. Mrs. gently but firmly, pointing out that the only documented aggressor in any incident this year had been Tyler, and that perhaps the community newsletter should focus on actual facts rather than thinly veiled insinuations about a 15-year-old honor student. Several other neighbors replied in support of Mrs. Alvarez's message, a small but visible crack in the unified politeness Deborah had maintained around herself for years. I said nothing publicly, watching the thread instead, understanding that Deborah's own overreach was doing more damage to her standing than anything I could have orchestrated myself. Gary forwarded me a second batch of invoices that week, this time showing a pattern stretching back nearly 5 years. The numbers growing bolder over time as apparently no one had ever thought to question them closely. Whitfield Ground Solutions had billed the HOA for services in neighborhoods that, on paper, didn't even exist. I brought everything to the journalist, Sarah Kim, who reviewed the documents with a careful, practiced eye, asking sharp questions about sourcing and chain of custody. She confirmed what Gary suspected. This wasn't just questionable billing anymore. It had the shape, potentially, of sustained financial fraud against the HOA's own membership. Sarah cautioned that publishing anything prematurely could allow Deborah time to destroy records or manufacture a cover story, advising instead that we wait for a natural flashpoint, an HOA meeting, an annual audit, something public enough that exposure couldn't be quietly buried the way Patricia's earlier concerns apparently had been. That flashpoint, we soon learned, was already scheduled. The HOA's annual town hall, 6 weeks out, where the year's finances were formally presented to the full membership and, per the bylaws Gary had researched carefully, any resident could request a formal financial review with sufficient co-signatures from other homeowners. Gathering those co-signatures quietly became my next task. Approaching neighbors I now trusted enough to loop in Frank, Mrs. Alvarez, Mrs. Jose by phone, Patricia in writing, Mr. Okafor, and several others who'd grown visibly uneasy watching Deborah's behavior over the preceding months, particularly regarding a teenager who'd done nothing wrong. Deborah, sensing perhaps that something was shifting beneath the surface of her community even if she couldn't name it exactly, tightened her grip further, issuing a wave of new citations across multiple households that week, seemingly at random, as if trying to remind everyone simultaneously who still held the pen. The randomness of the new citations, though, worked against her, uniting previously disconnected neighbors under a shared, specific grievance for the first time. People who'd never spoken to each other before started comparing notes at the mailbox, and my documented pattern suddenly had corroborating witnesses I hadn't even had to seek out myself. Tyler, perhaps sensing his mother's tightening grip mirrored in his own diminishing power at school, tried one final escalation before the town hall cornering. Elijah after practice, alone this time, no friends present as witnesses, in the school parking lot as the sun was setting and most students had already left. Elijah told me later that Tyler had shoved him first, hard, against a parked car, snarling something about how Elijah's record didn't matter because everyone knows why you're actually fast. A comment loaded with exactly the kind of ugliness Deborah had modeled for him his entire life without ever naming it directly. Elijah, trained for years in disciplined restraint, both athletically and, turned out, in boxing fundamentals from a community gym back home, simply stepped aside from the second shove, redirected Tyler's own momentum, and let him stumble into the car door himself without ever throwing a single punch in return. A teacher walking to her car witnessed the tail end of it. Enough to see Tyler shoving Elijah first and Elijah doing nothing but defensive footwork in response. She reported it immediately to the administration. And for the first time, the paper trail of incidents finally had an adult witness who wasn't Deborah's ally. I arrived at the school within the hour, and this time the story held together cleanly under scrutiny. The teacher's account, the parking lot's exterior camera footage, and Elijah's own composed statement all aligning perfectly. Tyler, for the first time, faced a suspension recommendation that even his father's booster club standing couldn't quietly erase. Deborah arrived at the school too, and the mask I'd watched her wear so carefully for months finally slipped in front of the vice principal, her voice rising sharply as she insisted the footage didn't show everything, and demanded to know why her son was being targeted by school administration and, implicitly, by us. The vice principal, unmoved, played the footage again for her directly, the shove clear and unambiguous on screen. Deborah's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Disbelief, then calculation, then a brittle, furious calm as she realized, perhaps for the first time, that her usual leverage wasn't working here. Tyler received a 3-day suspension and mandatory conflict counseling, a consequence so much smaller than what he'd actually earned that I had to remind myself. This was still progress. Still a crack in a system that had bent around the Whitfield family's comfort for years without anyone formally documenting it before now. That night, Deborah's fury apparently redirected itself back toward the neighborhood, because by morning a new, sweeping HOA notice had gone out to every household, announcing an emergency board review of resident conduct standards, clearly aimed at retaliating against the community broadly for what had happened to her son at school. The notice backfired instantly and completely. Neighbors who'd stayed quiet for years, afraid of becoming Deborah's next target, suddenly found themselves united by outrage on our family's behalf, several calling or texting me directly to ask how they could help, offering statements, offering signatures, offering years of their own quiet resentments finally spoken aloud. I told them all the same thing. Save it for the town hall. 5 weeks out now, where a formal financial review request would be on the table alongside. I hoped. A long overdue reckoning with exactly how Deborah Whitfield had been running Ridgemont Oaks like a fiefdom rather than a community for years. Sarah Kim, the journalist, began quietly researching public records on Whitfield Grounds Solutions independently, uncovering a business registration that had lapsed twice for non-payment of state fees, reinstated each time just before HOA billing cycles, a detail that suggested the company existed for very little purpose beyond generating those specific invoices. Patricia Nguyen agreed to attend the town hall in person, a decision that clearly cost her something given how visibly nervous she sounded discussing it on the phone. But she said she'd carried the guilt of staying silent for long enough and wanted to finally say her piece where it might actually matter. Elijah's suspension-adjacent notoriety at school shifted in an unexpected direction. Instead of isolating him further, it seemed to finally crystallize for his classmates what had actually been happening all along. Several students approaching him afterward to apologize for believing Tyler's rumors or simply for staying silent when they'd suspected the truth. For the first time since we'd moved to Ridgemont Oaks, Elijah came home from school looking something close to at peace. Not because the conflict was over, but because he no longer felt invisible inside it. No longer felt like the only person who could see clearly what had been happening to him. Deborah, cornered publicly for the first time in years, did not retreat gracefully. Neighbors began reporting a new wave of citations issued with almost frantic speed. Fines for holiday decorations displayed too early, for a garden bed exceeding approved dimensions, for a residence flag flown at an incorrect angle, each more absurd than the last. 143. Gary quietly confirmed something troubling during this period. Deborah had made 2 attempts to access the HOA's financial records outside of normal board hours,
using her president's key to the office late at night. Caught only because the building's aging security camera happened to still be functioning that particular week.
I asked Gary what he thought she was doing in there. He said he suspected she was trying to alter or remove the older invoices before the town hall's financial review could examine them closely. A theory that gained weight when, days later, several years' worth of physical paper records turned up mysteriously incomplete. Fortunately, Gary had already made digital copies of everything months earlier. A quiet act of foresight he credited to years of low-grade unease about Deborah's handling of the books. Unease he'd never had the courage to act on until watching her target a teenager gave him the push he needed. Deborah's desperation began bleeding into her public behavior in ways the neighborhood couldn't help but notice. Sharper tones at community events. A visible tremor in her hands during a routine landscaping presentation. An uncharacteristic outburst at a resident who'd simply asked a mundane question about pool maintenance scheduling. Tyler, meanwhile, returned from his suspension changed. Quieter, avoiding Elijah in the hallways rather than seeking him out, which some might have read as guilt but which Elijah described to me as something closer to fear of what might happen if the adults around him kept actually paying attention. That fear apparently didn't extend to Tyler's friend group entirely. Two of his friends, perhaps sensing the shifting tide, approached Elijah separately to apologize for their role in the earlier group chat. One of them admitting quietly that Tyler had shown them private messages from his mother encouraging him to put that kid in his place. Elijah brought this detail home immediately, understanding its weight even before I fully explained it. Direct evidence, even secondhand, that Deborah hadn't simply tolerated Tyler's bullying but had actively encouraged it, closing whatever thin deniability she'd maintained about her own role in what had been happening to my son for months. I asked the friend, with his parents' permission, if he'd be willing to put that account in writing for the town hall. He hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to Tyler and a growing discomfort with what he'd witnessed, but ultimately agreed, saying quietly that someone should have stopped this a long time ago. Deborah's paranoia about the upcoming town hall seemed to intensify daily, culminating in an unannounced visit to our house one evening. Arriving without her usual clipboard, without her usual practiced calm, just Deborah standing on our porch asking, almost pleading, what exactly I intended to bring up at the meeting. I told her, evenly, that residents had a right to request a financial review and that I intended to exercise that right. Nothing more specific than that. Her composure cracked slightly at my refusal to elaborate, and for a moment I saw something underneath the HOA president persona. Genuine, cornered fear. You don't understand what you're doing, she said quietly, almost to herself. This community depends on stability, on people trusting the process. I told her I understood exactly what I was doing, and that stability built on silencing families like mine and the Osays wasn't stability worth protecting in the first place. She left without another word, and I watched her walk back across the street with a stiffness in her posture I hadn't seen before, the confident stride of a woman used to controlling every room replaced by something smaller, something aware, for the first time, that the room might not be hers to control much longer. That same week, Sarah Kim's research uncovered something neither Gary nor I had anticipated. Deborah's husband's company, the same one behind the phantom landscaping invoices, had also submitted bids for a since-abandoned community pool renovation years earlier, a project that had collected resident special assessments but never actually broken ground. The special assessment money, nearly $60,000 collected from every household in Ridgemont Oaks under the promise of a renovated pool, appeared to have simply evaporated into the same accounting fog as the landscaping invoices, with no public accounting ever provided to residents about where exactly it had gone. I remembered, with a cold jolt, that our own moving-in packet had included a line item referencing this same pool assessment as a closed, completed project. A lie so casually embedded in official paperwork that it had never once occurred to me to question it before now. Mr. the retired accountant offered to review Gary's compiled documents formally, applying his professional experience to organize everything into something a general audience could follow clearly at the town hall. A simple, damning timeline of invoices, assessments, and lapsed business registrations spanning nearly 5 years of quiet siphoning. Deborah's bored allies, sensing the shifting mood, began quietly distancing themselves in small ways, one abstaining from a minor vote she would normally have supported automatically, another simply not returning her calls as promptly as before. Power, turned out, was more fragile than Deborah had ever allowed herself to believe. Tyler's father, Robert Whitfield, largely absent from the conflict until now, appeared unexpectedly at our door one evening, looking uncomfortable and out of his depth, asking if there was a way to handle this quietly before the town hall. A phrase that told me exactly how much he already understood about his family's exposure. I told him, honestly, that quiet handling was precisely how Deborah had operated for years, and that quiet had already cost my son his sense of safety in his own neighborhood and cost the Osei family their home here entirely. I told him the time for quiet had passed. He left without arguing further. Elijah's training continued through all of this with a steadiness that impressed even Coach Duval, who told me privately she'd never seen a young athlete channel personal turmoil into performance so effectively, his time still dropping week over week even as the neighborhood around him grew tenser by the day. 2 weeks before the town hall, Deborah made her most extreme move yet, filing a formal complaint with the local police alleging Elijah had threatened Tyler with violence during an encounter that, upon investigation, turned out to have never actually occurred, fabricated entirely from nothing but her own escalating desperation. The responding detective, this time more thorough given the department's growing familiarity with our address, quickly established that Elijah had been at track practice, verified by Coach Duval and a dozen teammates, during the exact window Deborah claimed the threat occurred, rendering her complaint not just false but demonstrably, provably false. Filing a false police report, the detective informed me quietly, was itself a chargeable offense, though whether the department would pursue it against a well-connected HOA president remained an open question I intended to make sure didn't stay quiet for long, especially not with the town hall now so close. I filed a formal complaint of my own regarding the false report, and for the first time, Deborah found herself on the receiving end of the same institutional scrutiny she'd weaponized against us for months. A reversal that felt less like revenge and more like the simple, overdue application of consequence. Deborah's public composure finally fully cracked at a chance encounter at the grocery store, where she confronted me in the cereal aisle, voice raised enough that other shoppers turned to look, accusing me of destroying this community and turning everyone against her with what she called lies and manipulation. I stayed calm, deliberately so, aware that her outburst in public was doing more to confirm the pattern I documented than anything I could have said myself. A store employee, unprompted, later confirmed to me she'd write a statement about the encounter if it ever became relevant to anything official. Word of the grocery store scene spread through the neighborhood faster than anything else had, several versions circulating within a day, most of them, notably, sympathetic to me rather than to Deborah, A clear sign of how far her standing had eroded even among neighbors who'd never spoken up before. Tyler, isolated now from most of his friend group and clearly aware of his mother's unraveling composure, approached Elijah alone at school one final time before the town hall. Not with aggression this time, but with something that looked almost like the beginning of genuine, uncertain regret. "My mom says all this is your fault," Tyler said, though his tone lacked its usual conviction. "But I don't actually know why I ever believed her about you." Elijah didn't offer forgiveness. Not yet. But he didn't walk away either. A small, wary opening neither of them fully knew what to do with. That fragile moment didn't erase months of harm. And Elijah told me later he wasn't ready to call it anything like friendship. But it marked the first crack of humanity in a boy who'd been raised, deliberately or not, to see cruelty toward people like Elijah as simply how the world worked. Deborah, perhaps sensing Tyler's wavering loyalty as another sign of her collapsing control, doubled down instead of reflecting, calling an emergency board meeting of her own before the town hall, attempting to push through a rule change that would limit resident speaking time at the upcoming financial review to 90 seconds each. The board, for the first time in Deborah's presidency, voted against her proposal outright, Gary casting the deciding vote with a quiet, steady explanation that residents deserved a full and fair hearing, especially given everything the community had watched unfold over the preceding months without adequate answers. Deborah's authority as HOA president, once absolute and unquestioned, had visibly eroded to the point where her own board no longer reliably followed her lead. A shift so significant that even Frank, who'd warned me about her from the very beginning, admitted he'd never seen anything like it in his 15 years there. 1 week before the town hall, Sarah Kim's editor greenlit a preliminary article, cautious and carefully sourced, outlining the pattern of citations against multiple families and the unresolved questions around Whitfield Grounds solutions, scheduled to publish the day after the meeting regardless of what happened there. Insurance against any last-minute cover-up. Deborah, apparently informed of the impending article through some remaining loyalist, attempted one final desperate maneuver, reaching out to Mrs. Osei's family directly, offering, according to Mrs. Osei's furious call to me afterward, to waive remaining fines in exchange for their silence about what had happened when they'd lived in Ridgemont Oaks. Mrs. immediately and forwarded me the message, adding it to the growing pile of evidence that Deborah wasn't simply defending herself anymore but actively attempting to obstruct accountability, a distinction that mattered enormously for how the town hall, and potentially any legal proceedings afterward, would ultimately unfold. Elijah, watching all of this build around him with a maturity that still occasionally startled me, asked if he could speak at the town hall himself, not about the citations or the financial fraud, but simply about what it had actually felt like to be a 15-year-old target of an adult's campaign against his family. I told him it was entirely his choice, that he'd already carried more than enough without needing to perform his pain publicly if he didn't want to, but that if he did want to speak, I would stand beside him for every single word of it. He said he wanted to, quietly, firmly. Coach Duvall offered to attend as well, along with 2 of Elijah's teammates who'd witnessed the parking lot incident's aftermath, and even the friend of Tyler's who'd agreed to put his account of Deborah's encouragement in writing showed up unexpectedly at our door, saying he wanted to be there in person too. The night before the town hall, Deborah's house stayed lit until nearly 2 in the morning. Frank reported the next day, having noticed from his own insomnia-plagued porch watch. Whatever she was doing in there, preparing a defense, destroying more records, simply panicking, the wait was almost over for both of us. I barely slept myself, running through everything one final time. Gary's invoices, Patricia's statement, Mrs. Osei's citations, Sarah's research into the pool assessment, the false police report, Tyler's friend's written account, and my own carefully documented year of fines that had never once been applied evenly across the neighborhood. Elijah found me at the kitchen table at midnight, the same way I'd found him weeks earlier staring at his old medals. "Are you scared?" he asked. I told him the truth, that I was a little, but that being scared and being ready weren't opposites. And we were absolutely, finally, ready. The morning of the town hall arrived gray and humid, the kind of heavy air that made the whole neighborhood feel like it was holding its breath along with us. I checked the folder one final time, every document organized, every copy made, every witness confirmed to attend. Nothing left to chance if I could help it. Gary called early, voice tight with nerves I hadn't heard from him before, confirming he'd secured additional printed copies of the invoices for board members and would formally request the financial review the moment the meeting's agenda allowed for it. Per the bylaws, he'd now read more carefully than perhaps anyone else in Ridgemont Oaks. Sarah Kim texted to confirm she'd be attending as a resident observer rather than announcing herself as press, wanting to witness the meeting firsthand before her. Article published the following day regardless of outcome. A piece of leverage that existed now whether or not anyone in that room chose to act on what they heard. Mrs. from 2 towns over, bringing her own folder of citations, meeting us in the parking lot with a hug that surprised me with its intensity, a shared understanding passing between us that needed no further explanation after everything both our families had endured in this neighborhood. Patricia Nguyen arrived visibly nervous but resolute, telling me quietly that she'd rehearsed what she wanted to say a dozen times the night before, determined not to let years of accumulated silence swallow her words again the way it had the first time she tried to raise concerns about Deborah years earlier. Elijah dressed carefully that morning, choosing, without any prompting from me, to wear his old track jacket from his previous school, medals visible through the jacket's small trophy pin on the collar. Quiet, deliberate reclamation of an identity Deborah and Tyler had spent months trying to diminish or dismiss. The clubhouse parking lot filled faster than I'd ever seen it. Neighbors arriving early, clustering in small groups with a tension in the air that felt different from every previous meeting, less like community business and more like a courtroom gallery gathering before a verdict everyone sensed was finally coming. Deborah arrived last, deliberately, sweeping in with her usual clipboard and a composure that, close, I could now see was almost entirely performance. Her hands gripping the clipboard's edge just a fraction too tightly for someone who wanted to appear unbothered by the size and mood of the crowd. Robert Whitfield sat near the back rather than beside his wife at the board table. A small but telling detail that didn't escape the room's notice. Several neighbors exchanging quiet glances at the visible distance between them. A marriage apparently already straining under the weight of everything about to surface. Tyler was absent entirely, and Elijah told me later he'd received a brief, Unexpected text from him that morning simply saying, "Good luck today." Ambiguous in its intent, but Elijah thought, probably as close to an apology as Tyler currently had the courage to offer anyone directly. The meeting opened with routine business. Landscaping updates, pool maintenance schedules, the mundane rhythm of community governance dragging on for nearly 20 minutes while the real tension in the room built beneath the surface. Everyone waiting for the agenda to reach the item that actually mattered to them. When the floor finally opened for resident requests, Gary stood first, voice steady despite his obvious nerves, formally requesting an independent financial review of the HOA's accounts for the past 5 years, citing his own concerns as treasurer and presenting the co-signature petition I'd helped gather from dozens of households. Deborah's composure flickered visibly as Gary spoke. Her eyes darting toward the growing stack of signatures he set on the table, clearly recalculating in real time just how many people in this room had quietly turned against the version of events she'd controlled for so many years. She tried to deflect, suggesting the request was premature and based on misunderstandings. But Mr. Okafor stood next, calm and methodical, laying out the timeline of Whitfield Ground Solutions invoices with the precision of a man who'd spent his career finding exactly these kinds of discrepancies for a living. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the numbers were read aloud. The phantom landscaping charges, the lapsed business registrations reinstated suspiciously on schedule, and finally, the $60,000 pool assessment that had never resulted in a single shovel of dirt being turned for the community pool it was collected to fund. Deborah's voice rose sharply, insisting the pool project had been delayed, not abandoned, but Sarah Kim, standing quietly among the residents, raised her hand and calmly noted that public records showed no permits had ever been filed for the project at all. In 5 full years since the assessment was collected. The room's temperature shifted palpably at that, whispers turning into open, audible disbelief, several neighbors turning to look at each other with the particular fury of people realizing they'd personally paid, out of their own pockets, into something that appeared to have simply vanished without any accountability whatsoever. Patricia Nguyen stood next, her voice shaking at first but steadying as she spoke, describing how she'd raised similar concerns years earlier and been quietly forced off the board within months. Her account met with visible discomfort from several longtime residents who clearly remembered her sudden, unexplained departure differently now. Mrs. laying out her own family's citation history alongside ours. The pattern undeniable once placed side by side. Nearly identical language. Nearly identical timing. Nearly identical escalation. Culminating for her family in a false theft accusation that had ultimately driven them out of the neighborhood entirely. Deborah attempted to interject repeatedly, but the board chair, visibly uncomfortable but following procedure, reminded her that resident statements were entitled to their allotted time, a small procedural fairness that, months earlier, would never have been extended so evenly against her own objections. I stood then, folder in hand, and laid out our own year methodically, the basketball hoop citation before it was even assembled, the trash confined beside identical uncited violations. The shed vandalism met with a citation rather than sympathy. The false police report, the slashed tires, the manufactured curfew proposal. I kept my voice level throughout, resisting the urge to let a year of accumulated anger spill into the delivery, because I understood that the facts, laid out plainly and without embellishment, carried more weight in that room than any amount of righteous fury I could have brought to the podium instead. When I finished, I turned to Elijah, and he stood, jacket collar catching the fluorescent light on its small trophy pin, and began to speak not about statistics or invoices, but about what it actually felt like to be 15 and watch an adult decide, before he'd said a single word, that he didn't belong. He talked about the group chat, about the betting pool over whether he'd snap, about scrubbing a slur off his own shed with his own hands because he couldn't bear for his father to see it first, about running every morning at 5 a.m. because it was the one thing no one could take from him. The room went completely silent during his account, the kind of silence that carries its own weight, and I watched several neighbors' faces crumple with a guilt that had clearly been building for months as they finally understood, fully and specifically, what their silence and inaction had allowed to happen next door to them. Elijah finished by saying he wasn't asking anyone to feel sorry for him, only to understand that excellence had never protected him from prejudice, that his record times and his discipline and his restraint had never once been the point for the people determined to see him as a problem before he arrived. Deborah, backed into a corner she'd never once anticipated occupying, made her final, desperate mistake, standing abruptly and declaring that Elijah's aggressive behavior toward Tyler justified everything, gesturing toward a phone in her hand, claiming she had video evidence of Elijah attacking her son that she'd been saving for the right moment. She played it on the clubhouse projector with shaking hands. A short, choppy clip showing Tyler stumbling backward with Elijah standing nearby. Edited. It was immediately obvious to cut off both before and after the actual moment. Exactly the kind of selective framing designed to manufacture guilt out of self-defense. But the school's own exterior camera footage, subpoenaed by the school district weeks earlier as part of Tyler's disciplinary review and shared with me through proper channels once relevant to this exact possibility, told the complete story, and I asked the board chair for permission to play it in full response. The unedited footage showed everything Deborah's clip had carefully cropped away. Tyler shoving Elijah first, twice, and Elijah doing nothing but stepping aside defensively, never once raising a hand. The same restraint he'd shown for months finally visible to an entire room instead of hidden behind Deborah's manipulated framing. The silence that followed wasn't guilty this time. It was the specific, collective silence of a room realizing exactly how thoroughly they'd been managed for years. How many boys will be boys comments and quiet nods had been built on a foundation of edited footage and manufactured narratives none of them had thought to question. Deborah's face drained of color as the footage finished, the clubhouse projector's light washing over her in a way that made the cracks in her composure look almost theatrical, though nothing about the fury and disbelief spreading through the room around her was anything but completely, devastatingly real. "That's not," she started, voice cracking for the first time anyone in that room had likely ever heard. "That video was doctored. That's not what actually happened. You don't understand what that boy is capable of." But the words died in her throat as she registered how they landed, how they sounded. Robert Whitfield stood from the back of the room, his face a mixture of horror and something that looked almost like relief at finally being freed from years of quietly enabling whatever version of reality his wife had insisted on maintaining. "Deborah," he said quietly, "stop talking. Please." She didn't stop. Not immediately. turning instead toward the crowd with an increasingly frantic energy, insisting the financial documents were misunderstandings, that the pool money was in a separate account for a future project. Details that grew more elaborate and less coherent with each sentence she added to her collapsing defense. Mr. asked, in front of the entire room, whether Deborah could produce that separate account statements right then, given she apparently had immediate knowledge of its existence. The question hung in the air, unanswered, because of course she couldn't, because of course no such account had ever actually existed. Gary, visibly shaken but resolute, formally moved that the board suspend Deborah's presidency effective immediately pending the results of the independent financial review, citing both the evident financial irregularities and the demonstrated pattern of retaliatory citations against multiple families, including the false police report filed weeks earlier. The motion required a second, and for a long, suspended moment, no one moved, the room's collective fear of Deborah's retaliation apparently still strong enough to freeze even the obvious right action. Then Robert Whitfield, still standing, said quietly but audibly, "I'll second it," his voice heavy with something like grief. The vote passed nearly unanimously, only one board member abstaining, and Deborah Whitfield's 6-year reign as HOA president ended not with the graceful transition she'd probably always imagined for herself, but with a suspended presidency, an active financial investigation, and an entire community watching her unravel in real time. She left the clubhouse without another word, walking quickly through the parking lot with her clipboard still clutched against her chest, past neighbors who, for the first time in years, didn't step aside to let her pass with the deference she'd always simply assumed was owed to her. The meeting continued in her absence, the board voting to formally invite the police to review both the false report Deborah had filed and the newly surfaced financial documents for potential fraud, while Sarah Kim quietly took notes for the article that would now, inevitably, need significant last-minute revision before publication. Mrs. standing near me afterward, said quietly that she never thought she'd see this day, that she'd assumed Deborah would simply keep operating this way indefinitely, protected by exactly the kind of institutional inertia and social fear that had let her get away with it for years before we ever arrived. Patricia Nguyen approached Elijah directly, thanking him for his courage in speaking, telling him that watching a 15-year-old say plainly what she herself had been too afraid to say as an adult board member years earlier had reminded her what actual integrity looked like under real pressure. Coach Duval found me near the exit, her expression somewhere between fury on Elijah's behalf and pride at how he'd handled himself throughout, saying simply, "That kid just showed more character in 10 minutes than most adults manage in a lifetime. I hope he knows that." Tyler's friend, the one who'd finally agreed to put Deborah's encouragement in writing, approached Elijah hesitantly afterward, admitting the meeting had made him understand for the first time just how deep the manipulation had run, apologizing again, more genuinely this time, for the role he'd played in the group chat. Robert Whitfield lingered by our row of chairs as the room slowly emptied, looking older than he had an hour earlier, and said quietly to me that he intended to speak with a lawyer about the family's own exposure, and that regardless of what happened next, he owed Elijah a real apology, not a performative one. I told him that apology belonged to Elijah, not to me, and that whether he offered it or not, The truth had already come out in the room tonight, in front of everyone, which was more accountability than families like ours had usually been allowed to receive in situations exactly like this one. Driving home that night, Elijah was quiet for a long stretch, staring out the window at the familiar streets of Ridgemont Oaks. Streets that felt different now, lighter somehow, even though nothing about the physical neighborhood had changed at all in the few hours since we'd left for the meeting. "Do you think it's actually over?" he asked finally. I told him honestly that the citations and Deborah's presidency were probably over, but that the deeper work, the investigation, the police report, whatever consequences actually followed, would take longer, and that we'd face all of it together, the same way we'd faced everything else. He nodded, then, after a long pause, said something that stuck with me for days afterward. "I'm glad I ran tonight too. Not on a track. Glad I didn't run from telling the truth, even when it was scary." I told him that was, without question, the fastest and bravest thing he'd done all year. The following morning, Sarah Kim's article published, revised overnight to include the town hall's dramatic conclusion, headlined starkly with the scope of the alleged fraud and the pattern of retaliatory harassment against multiple families, quickly picked up by a regional news outlet given the article's clear documentation and multiple named sources. The story spread through the wider community within days, drawing attention from residents in neighboring HOAs who recognized uncomfortably similar patterns in their own boards, several reaching out to Sarah directly with their own concerns, suggesting Deborah's playbook wasn't entirely unique to Ridgemont Oaks after all. The police, armed now with the town hall's public record, Gary's documentation, and the newly credible false report complaint I'd filed weeks earlier, opened a formal fraud investigation into Whitfield Ground Solutions and a separate investigation into the false police report Deborah had filed against Elijah. Deborah retained a lawyer within days, her public statements limited to a brief, carefully worded denial released through legal counsel, a stark contrast to the confident, unchecked authority she'd wielded so freely for years before a room full of neighbors and one determined 15-year-old finally stopped accepting her version of events. The HOA board, under Gary's interim leadership, voted to fully refund the pool assessment to every household pending the fraud investigation's outcome, and to formally rescind every citation issued to our family and the Osei family over the preceding year. A small but meaningful act of institutional correction. Mrs. Tell me the news of the rescinded citations with tears audible in her voice, saying it didn't undo the 8 months her family had suffered, or the home they'd ultimately lost, but that hearing Ridgemont Oaks formally acknowledge what had happened to them meant more than she'd expected it to. Tyler, without his mother's protective apparatus shielding him from consequences for the first time in his life, faced a longer school suspension once the full parking lot footage became part of the official disciplinary record, along with mandatory counseling that, according to Coach Duval, he actually seemed to engage with seriously. He approached Elijah once more, weeks later, this time with an apology that felt different from the earlier hallway exchange, specific, unhedged, acknowledging directly what he'd done and why it had been wrong, rather than simply expressing vague regret about how things had turned out for himself. Elijah accepted the apology carefully, telling me afterward that he didn't think they'd ever be friends, and that he didn't owe Tyler that closeness regardless of the apology's sincerity. but that he could recognize the difference between a boy who'd been taught cruelty and a boy finally choosing to unlearn it. Robert Whitfield filed for divorce 3 weeks after the town hall. A decision that surprised no one who'd watched him stand at the back of that meeting, seconding a motion against his own wife. A marriage apparently already hollowed out by years of accommodating behavior, he could no longer defend even to himself. Deborah's legal troubles deepened as the fraud investigation progressed. Forensic accountants confirming Mr. Okafor's initial assessment almost exactly, tracing nearly $70,000 in misappropriated HOA funds across 5 years. Funds that had funded, among other things, a family vacation Deborah had once described publicly as self-financed. The false police report charge, initially uncertain given Deborah's community standing, moved forward once the district attorney's office reviewed the full documentation, including the demonstrably false timeline that contradicted Coach Duvall's independently verified attendance records from the afternoon in question. I received a call from the district attorney's office asking if Elijah would be willing to provide a formal statement regarding the pattern of harassment,
Explaining it could strengthen both the fraud and false report cases by establishing clear motive and context for Deborah's escalating behavior over the preceding months.
Elijah agreed without hesitation, though I made sure he understood exactly what providing that statement would mean. A formal, recorded account, potentially referenced in court, of everything he'd endured. He said he wanted to do it. That silence had protected Deborah for years, and he wasn't interested in extending that protection any further. The statement, when finally recorded, was calm and precise. Elijah walking through the timeline methodically the way Coach Duvall had taught him to walk through a race strategy, controlled pacing, no wasted energy, every detail placed exactly where it needed to be for maximum, undeniable clarity. News of the investigation reached the university scout who'd watched Elijah's record-breaking run at the Invitational, and rather than the concern I half feared, her response was entirely supportive, saying the program valued character as much as speed, and that watching how Elijah had handled the entire situation only strengthened their interest in him. An official scholarship offer arrived 2 weeks later. Formal and substantial, timed in a way that felt almost like the universe finally, deliberately correcting course after a year that had tested my son far beyond what any 15-year-old should reasonably have to endure just for existing quietly in his own neighborhood. Elijah read the offer letter twice before saying anything, then looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him since before his mother died, pure, uncomplicated joy, unshadowed for once by grief or vigilance or the exhausting calculus of navigating a world that too often decided who he was before he spoke. We celebrated quietly that night, just the two of us, his favorite dinner and the medals finally, permanently displayed on his shelf instead of hidden in a box. And for the first time since the moving truck had pulled away from our old life, Ridgemont Oaks actually felt like it might become home. Mrs. A small neighborhood gathering the following weekend. Not the polished, performative kind Deborah used to host, but something warmer and more genuine. Neighbors bringing real food and real conversation. Several approaching Elijah directly to congratulate him and, quietly, to apologize for their earlier silence. Frank pulled me aside during the gathering, coffee in hand as always, and said he'd lived in Ridgemont Oaks for 15 years and never once felt like it was actually a community until that town hall. That sometimes it took someone willing to fight for the whole neighborhood to finally start acting like one. Gary was formally elected HOA president in the following month's special election, running unopposed, his first act in office being the establishment of an independent annual financial audit conducted by an outside firm, a structural change designed to ensure no future president could quietly run the books the way Deborah had for years. The fraud case against Deborah proceeded through the following months, forensic evidence mounting steadily, her legal defense growing thinner with each new document Mr. Okafor's careful analysis surfaced, the $60,000 pool assessment alone constituting enough for serious felony charges under state law once formally filed by the district attorney. Deborah was formally charged that autumn, felony theft by deception related to the misappropriated HOA funds, and separately, filing a false police report, charges that carried the real possibility of both significant fines and jail time, a consequence that would have seemed impossible to imagine the day we first moved in. She pleaded not guilty initially, her lawyer attempting to characterize the missing funds as accounting errors rather than deliberate fraud, a defense that collapsed almost immediately. Once the prosecution introduced the pattern of lapsed and suspiciously reinstated business registrations tied directly to her husband's company, timed exactly with HOA billing cycles. The trial, when it finally arrived nearly a year after the town hall, drew significant local attention, Sarah Kim covering it extensively for her outlet. The courtroom gallery filled on several days with Ridgemont Oaks residents who'd once been too afraid to challenge Deborah directly now sitting in open, public witness to her reckoning. Gary testified about the financial discrepancies with the same careful precision he'd brought to every conversation since first calling me from that diner months earlier.
His testimony methodical and devastating in its simple, factual clarity, leaving little room for the defense's increasingly desperate attempts at reasonable doubt.
Patricia Nguyen testified about her own experience being pushed off the board years earlier after raising similar concerns, establishing for the jury that this wasn't an isolated incident but a sustained, years-long pattern of financial misconduct enabled by Deborah's careful cultivation of unquestioned authority within the community she governed. Mrs. about her family's experience with the citation pattern and the false theft accusation that had ultimately driven them from their home, her testimony visibly moving several jury members. Quiet, dignified account of exactly what it costs a family to be systematically pushed out of a place they tried to make home. I testified about our own year of documented citations, laid out chronologically with the same organized precision I'd used at the town hall. The defense's cross-examination unable to meaningfully shake the timeline or the corroborating evidence from multiple independent sources across more than a year of documentation. Elijah testified last among the witnesses regarding the harassment pattern, calm and composed on the stand despite the obvious weight of the moment, walking the jury through the group chat, the false gym class accusation, the parking lot shove, and finally the false police report that had almost derailed his entire academic future. Under cross-examination, Deborah's lawyer attempted to characterize Elijah's composure as evidence he hadn't actually been harmed, a strategy that visibly backfired when Elijah calmly explained that composure under pressure was something he'd trained for years to develop, precisely because people like Deborah had taught him early that he couldn't afford to lose control. The prosecution's closing argument leaned heavily on that exact testimony, framing Deborah's pattern of behavior not as isolated incidents but as a sustained abuse of institutional power against families she'd decided, based on nothing but her own prejudice, didn't belong in the community she'd appointed herself to protect and define. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning a verdict. Guilty on the felony theft by deception charge. Guilty on the false police report charge. The courtroom gallery breaking into a controlled but audible wave of relief and vindication that Deborah's lawyer immediately moved, unsuccessfully, to quiet Deborah's face. When the verdict was read, held none of the composed authority she'd once wielded so effortlessly across 6 years of HOA meetings and community events, replaced instead by a stunned, hollow disbelief, as if some part of her had genuinely never imagined a world where consequence actually reached her. Sentencing followed 6 weeks later. The judge citing both the financial scope of the fraud and the documented pattern of retaliatory harassment against multiple families as aggravating factors, ultimately imposing 18 months of incarceration along with a lengthy probation period and mandatory full financial restitution to every affected household. The restitution amount, once finalized, meant every family in Ridgemont Oaks who'd paid into the phantom pool assessment or absorbed unjustified fines would eventually be made financially whole, a small but concrete measure of accountability that Gary, in his new role as president, personally oversaw distributing fairly and transparently. Robert Whitfield's divorce finalized around the same time as the sentencing, and he moved out of the neighborhood entirely within months. Unable, he told a few remaining neighbors, to keep living in the house where he'd spent years quietly enabling a version of his wife, he could no longer pretend not to see clearly. Tyler stayed with his father, transferring to a different school district for his junior year. A fresh start not entirely unlike the one Elijah and I had once hoped for ourselves, though I found myself hoping, without much expectation, that he might actually use it to become someone different from what he'd been raised to be. Ridgemont Oaks itself transformed slowly but noticeably under Gary's leadership. Citations became rare, applied evenly, always documented and justified. The annual financial audit became a genuine, transparent process, and the community newsletter, once a vehicle for Deborah's subtle campaigns, now simply reported real news without hidden agendas attached. Mrs. informed of both the restitution and the neighborhood's transformation, considered returning but ultimately decided they'd built a good life elsewhere, choosing instead to donate their restitution check to a scholarship fund for young athletes of color. A gesture Elijah told me moved him more than almost anything else that year. Elijah's senior year unfolded the way I'd once hoped his sophomore year might have. Unburdened, full of ordinary teenage milestones, prom, a college visit to the university that had recruited him, quiet Sunday dinners where he talked easily about his day instead of retreating silently into his room. He broke his own regional record twice more before graduation, each time with Coach Duval, Frank, Mrs. Alvarez, and Gary somewhere in the stands cheering. A found family of sorts assembled from exactly the neighbors who'd chosen courage over comfortable silence when it had actually mattered most. I found myself, in quieter moments, thinking often about how close we'd come to simply enduring Deborah's campaign silently, the way the Osei family initially had, the way countless families before them likely had in countless other neighborhoods. Worn down by exhaustion into leaving quietly rather than fighting loudly for what was right. What had made the difference, I came to believe, wasn't any single dramatic confrontation but the slow, patient accumulation of documentation, allies, and refusal to let isolated incidents be dismissed as isolated. The same disciplined persistence Elijah brought to his morning runs applied instead to simply refusing to disappear quietly. Elijah's college acceptance letter arrived that spring alongside the scholarship confirmation, and we celebrated with the same small, quiet dinner tradition we'd started. The night his first offer arrived, medals now lining an entire shelf, each one a marker of a year he'd survived with more grace than most adults could have managed. Coach Duval, at his final home meet, told the assembled crowd during a brief tribute that Elijah represented everything coaching was supposed to be about. Not just speed or talent, but character forged under real pressure. A description that drew a standing ovation from a crowd that included nearly every neighbor who'd once stayed silent. Gary, addressing the community at that same event in his capacity as HOA president, publicly acknowledged for the first time how close Ridgemont Oaks had come to losing itself entirely to quiet, institutionalized cruelty, and how much the community owed to one family who'd simply refused to accept that cruelty as normal. Frank, predictably, cried through most of the ceremony, later claiming loudly it was allergies, a running joke between us that had become, somewhere along the way, a genuine and comfortable friendship neither of us had expected when he'd first pulled me aside at the mailbox to warn me about Deborah Whitfield. Mrs. organized a scholarship fund of her own within the neighborhood, seated partly by resident donations and partly, ironically, by unspent HOA funds recovered during the audit, specifically to support young athletes from families new to the community, ensuring no future kid would have to run 5 a.m. miles quite so alone. Standing at Elijah's graduation that June, watching him walk across the stage in his cap and gown, medals from that final record-breaking season somehow catching the light exactly the way his old ones had years earlier. I thought about how far we traveled from that first day, unloading boxes under Deborah's watchful, judging eyes. Deborah, released after serving her sentence, did not return to Ridgemont Oaks, choosing instead to relocate quietly to another state, her name occasionally surfacing in local news coverage. Whenever another HOA elsewhere faced similar allegations, a pattern Sarah Kim continued tracking loosely, professional curiosity never fully fading after everything she'd uncovered. The neighborhood itself settled into something genuinely resembling the community Deborah had always claimed to be building but never actually was. Imperfect, occasionally still bureaucratic, in frustrating ways, but fundamentally fair. Its citations applied evenly, its finances transparent, its new families welcomed without the quiet, conditional suspicion we'd once endured. Tyler reached out once more, the summer after Elijah's graduation, a brief, genuine message congratulating him on the scholarship and admitting he'd spent the intervening year in therapy unpacking exactly how he'd been raised to see people like Elijah. A small, honest accounting that Elijah told me he appreciated without needing to build anything further from it. Mrs. years younger than Elijah, ended up receiving the first scholarship funded partly by her family's restitution money. A full-circle detail Mrs. Osei called to share with tears in her voice, saying it felt like something good had finally, deliberately grown out of everything Ridgemont Oaks had once cost her family. I kept the folder, the original one, in a box in our closet, not out of lingering anger but as a reminder of exactly what patient documentation and community courage could accomplish against even the most entrenched, unchecked authority, a lesson I hoped Elijah would carry with him long after he left for college that fall. On the morning Elijah left for campus, he woke at 5, laced up his shoes, and ran one final loop around Ridgemont Oaks before we loaded the car. The same ritual that had once felt like defiance and now simply felt like joy. Uncomplicated and finally his own. Watching him disappear around the corner and reappear minutes later. Breath steady. Pace easy. I understood that whatever Deborah Whitfield had tried to take from him, his safety, his sense of belonging, his right to simply exist quietly in a new neighborhood, he had, in the end, outrun every bit of it. We drove to campus that afternoon with his medals packed carefully in a box beside him. Not hidden this time, but displayed proudly on his dorm room shelf within the hour. A 15-year-old boy who'd once scrubbed a slur off his own family's shed, now beginning an entirely new chapter. Entirely on his own terms. Ridgemont Oaks, behind us in the rearview mirror, had become something neither of us could have predicted that first anxious week of citations and cold smiles. Not a battleground, not a cautionary tale, but simply, finally, home. Built not by Deborah Whitfield's rules but by the neighbors who'd chosen courage when it counted most.